but this time might not always be the best. And so we're trying to continue to adjust and support schools, as you heard, across the country as well. So time zones, all of those things. So we do record Coaches Network meetings, so just be aware we will post the recording. So anything you're sharing is going to be, shared with all that are on the call as well as others. As I mentioned,
except your breakout rooms, we're not going to be recording during breakout room time.
Great point. Yes, your breakout rooms are not recorded. So just the main content area and your report outs from breakout rooms. So today, the materials are posted on our Coaches Network meeting page. So if you go to midwestpbis.org and under the Coaches tab and Coaches Network meetings, and then you should find the content for today's Coaches Network meeting. And we want to make sure all of you that are joining, if you've joined us before, we're Midwest PBIS Network, and we are a hub of the National Center, the Center on PBIS. Lots of resources and support coming from the Center on PBIS, so pbis.org. If you haven't been to their website, we continue to highlight lots of resources from the partners, our National Center, and all the partners that work with that center. And we also are now, our fiscal agent in the state of Illinois is West 40 ISC. And so we're super excited to be housed under West 40 and continuing our collaborations with them. We want to acknowledge everyone that's helped with at least the content that we've included in today's session. So there are many partners that we pulled from, both from our national PBIS partners as well as school districts examples, and of course our national center. But really we want to acknowledge all of you who are implementing PBIS in your schools and continuing to share examples and support one another. So we just want to keep saying that we believe we're all in this together, and we keep hearing from schools, yes, share my example, because we know how hard this is. And so on today's network meeting, we really hope that you are open to sharing your examples and supporting one another as we go through. So we want to create those opportunities. That is our main goal of Coaches Network meetings. For those of you that have joined us in person for Coaches Network meetings over the past years, you know that Coaches Network meetings are about learning the updates around tools and messages, but also a great opportunity to learn and network with other implementing schools, coaches, administrators, teachers. We welcome anyone to Coaches Network meetings and to really gain a deeper knowledge of your implementation. So today's structure, as we continue to adjust and move to a virtual format, is we want to use kind of a think, pair, share model. And so as we go through content, we want to kind of prime your brains for, here's some considerations around Tier 2 implementation, data decision rules, those kinds of that content. And then we want to give you an opportunity to talk that through, share what's going on in your district, in your school, with a smaller group. So about 4 or 5 of you in a breakout room. You'll be with the same group each time we go into a breakout room. So hopefully you get to know each other, and just a smaller group conversation around what's happening or the content that we just discussed. And then we hope to be able to bring you back and hear some things you've learned in those breakouts, or an example that you want to highlight that you heard about in the breakout. So hopefully you have the opportunity to network with a smaller group, but then also hear from everybody who's on this call through this process. We want to make sure that there's ways for you to continue to share your examples and see other school examples. So we did create a shared Google folder on our website. This is on that same Coaches Network meeting page where you're finding the content for today, right above the materials. It's the shared folder for COVID-19 examples. When you open that, you're going to get a instruction document so that everybody knows some tips for sharing in Google and how to, set your documents up for sharing and things. So there's a link then to the shared folder. And so if you're comfortable with sharing your example and having others be able to access your example, then I would, we encourage you to share here and also visit this folder to see what others are sharing around their learning matrices or teaching lessons, or how they're using data. The other option while we're on this call today is you should have the option to share a file through chat. So if you don't want to go and share it in that shared folder, you can share it through chat today with the participants on this call. As we're joining, we don't want to forget that we always want to establish what our learning expectations are. I've already established a few of those. We really hope that you can be engaged with us and sharing and talking with others on this call and learning from one another. And you should automatically, I think, be muted, but mute your audio. We love to be able to see your faces, and we know that's not always possible. So if you are comfortable and in a space that you can share your camera, that's always helpful to us. And most of all, we really hope that you are committed to taking back action steps and making change in your implementation. So that you are here to learn and take things back and documenting those action steps. So just a couple quick reminders. I think most of us have adjusted to the world of Zoom quite seamlessly now, but you can mute and unmute at the bottom of your screen. You can turn on and off your video. You should also be able to access chat, which I see many of you are finding, to be able to share with us and share those documents. There is the warning that private chats aren't all necessarily private. After the meeting, if we download the chat, we can see your private chats, which is usually not a problem, but just make sure you're not talking about our hairstyle or something else like that you don't want us to see, because we can see that later. So we like to make sure everyone's aware of that. You can see everybody's video through the gallery view at the top of your screen. If you're trying to access resources, you should also be able to exit full screen so you can go to the PowerPoint or our website for materials. We might ask you to engage with us through different reactions through the participant. You can access those through the participant list. If you signed in and your sign in is maybe saying something that is not your first and last name and you're looking for professional development hours, you'll want to rename yourself so that we can make sure that you receive that credit and your email is correct. So you can rename again through that participant pod, or I believe also from the little dots on your picture, you might be able to rename yourself. We do offer professional development hours. Those of you that joined us in August and you're saying, but I never got those for August, we were adjusting to some new systems. So remember, I said we're now part of West 40. So thanks for your patience while we've updated our systems. We do have those ready to send out for August. So you'll be receiving August soon via email. And then September's should be coming in within a couple weeks after today's session. So we will be offering professional development hours for these meetings throughout this school year. So we're excited for that. As we get started, we want to, this year we're going to continue to think about these overarching themes for Coaches Network meetings. And so where we're really going to focus as we talk about Tier 2 and returning to learning this fall is that we really have to focus on not just students accessing support, but knowing that students are responding to the supports that we're providing. So as we talk through today, and we're talking about Tier 2 interventions, it's not just identifying students to receive those supports, but also knowing that the students accessing those interventions are actually responding to those interventions. We wouldn't just say that if Amy's going to a reading intervention, that's enough. We need to know that that reading intervention made a difference, right? So as we shift and think about our interventions for hybrid and remote instruction, we're also going to have to think about ensure that the response is there from students getting those interventions as well. And the other key component here, as you think about Tier 2 interventions, is going to continue to build off of those core features of a multi-tiered system of support. So we have implementation logic that we can use our PBIS or multi-tiered framework to help us with problem solving it's a framework for installing, right? So as you think about returning to learning, if it's hybrid, if it's remote, if it's in person, we want to continue to come back to using those core features of that multi-tiered framework to help us to implement. And so those core features, what teams are problem solving what, right? Who's having what conversation, who's looking at the data, and who's making decisions around that? What kind of data are we using? Do we need to adjust our data that we're using? How do we know that we're identifying students early so that we are more on that prevention end than that reactive end of data? And so as we're returning in a very different fashion this year, we need to consider the data there, and do we need any changes in what data we're monitoring or adding any additional data points? A formal process for selecting interventions. We're building a continuum of supports, and right now it might be really easy to want to slip into something new and shiny to help us out in a very challenging and unusual returning to education setting, right? And so we want to make sure that we don't slip into that there's this temptation of something new, but instead really follow our procedures and our the systems that we've set up. So how are we making sure that we maybe modify what we know is best practice to support in these new learning contexts? And how are we going to continue with professional development and coaching to all of our staff as we shift how we're supporting students this school year? So today we are really going to talk more about Tier 2 interventions, and remembering that Tier 2 interventions are for some students, and Tier 2 interventions are about being highly efficient and effective, right? So we always are selecting practices that we know have evidence and building off of and ensuring that we implement those practices with fidelity. In order to implement Tier 2 interventions effectively, we have to have a solid Tier 1, right? So the multi-tiered framework is always about layering on interventions and building off of what we've done at Tier 1. So to talk about Tier 1 or Tier 2 interventions, we have to make sure first that our Tier 1 is solid and we have something to build off of. So we want to remind you of some of the practices and examples that we gave in the August coaches meeting around how are we thinking about returning to learn with hybrid, remote, or in person at Tier 1. So how have you modified Tier 1? Have you redefined your behavioral matrix for your learning setting? Have you maybe made a remote learning matrix aligned to your school-wide expectations and redefined what those rules might look, or the behaviors might look like and those rules look like for different settings for remote instruction? So thanks to Bensonville Middle School for providing this example. I love the visuals. This is an example from a National Center product around a hybrid learning example, right? Or even your in-person school-wide matrix. There's probably rules and expectations that have needed to be updated depending on different settings for social distancing, wearing masks, washing hands. So, making sure that we're updating those matrices, but that's not enough, right? We can't just update the learning matrix or behavioral matrix in our posters and think now staff and students know those expectations. We have to teach that. Right? And so when are we teaching? How are we embedding teaching into our schedules when there's so much else happening with our learning this school year? But here's an example from a school in U46 where they are having morning meetings and daily attendance for their remote learning. And so each morning they're checking in, they're having that social emotional relationship connection in the morning. And then they also make sure that they're integrating social emotional learning within their literacy blocks. So integrating it within their academic learning as well. So what's your teaching schedule look like? How can you guarantee that teachers are teaching the social emotional skills? how are we making sure that we're still using acknowledgments and at least the behavior specific praise step of acknowledgments, right? We want to make sure that that when we're using acknowledgments that we use those steps for specific praise for behavior. And so how are we supporting staff to shift their behavior specific praise if we are remote? How do we help teachers become fluent with giving behavior specific praise when they're teaching remote or distal? What about your processes for documenting and responding to problem behavior? So we hope that we all have a flow chart of how do we respond to problem behavior, and some of those processes might need to be updated. Most likely you're not going to be writing a referral and sending a student down to the office. Some of those procedures might need to be updated. So does our Tier 1 team need to revisit our flow chart? How do we help staff and our teachers think about the continuum of response to inappropriate behavior when we're virtual? When we're teaching on Zoom, how do we use proximity? How do we use reteaching? What might that look like? So how can we adjust that continuum of response to virtual learning? And sometimes this is just allowing teachers to have conversations about what does that look like for them, right? So how, as a coach, might you be able to support all staff using a continuum of response? And have you thought about your problem behavior definitions for both minor and major problem behaviors in a virtual setting if you're doing distance learning? So do you need to make some adjustments to defining what those problem behaviors are and for documenting? So these are some examples from PBIS apps or our Swiss with those updates. So those are some of the examples that we went over in a more in-depth fashion in August. And so if you're like, oh, that went really quick and I want some more of those, and you didn't see August, you can look at those materials. They are posted right above September. But we want to give you now the opportunity to get into a small group, introduce yourself. This will be the group that you will be with throughout our time today. Introduce yourself, and then share one thing that you have shifted at Tier 1 in your returning to learn plan that you're really proud of. And then identify someone that might report out as we come back together. Diane, what were some things that people have adjusted at Tier 1 and some things that you're proud of how you've returned to your learning? You can share in chat. You can come off mute.
Great, Karen.
Karen's saying a revamped matrix. If you're willing to share examples, you can upload them in that folder. You can share them in chat. How many people have modified their behavioral matrix? Give me a thumbs up. I can kind of see some people if you're on video. Awesome. Virtual stores, Rachel, I think people would love to see ideas that you've put in a virtual store, or any you want to highlight. A list of rewards. So so PBIS rewards is actually not our national center, but they did have a list of rewards for virtual acknowledgements. So that was shared in chat. Modifying your boot camp. Who is that, Elizabeth? Was that a virtual boot camp?
We did. It was really quite, and the whole district, what we did was we came together, and we have several buildings within our district that PBIS. But anyway, we modified, each building took a particular area to focus on. We had one slide deck. It was a virtual slide deck, and you clicked on a little button and it took you to the bus expectations, or it took you to, what does it look like coming into the building? What does it look like going out of the building? So those types of things. But then for the classroom teachers, we also modified the cool tools to go along with that. So that instructional component there to match, you know, what we were teaching in the boot camp. But with those cool tools, we modified the activities, we modified the resources that were in there, the scenarios that were in there, a lot of the mask wearing, a lot of the 6 feet apart, those types of things. So our tier 1 team worked really hard even before school started to get those things ready.
That's awesome, Libby.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for sharing that. What else has the beginning of the year looked like for you? Training paras for check and check out coaches and facilitators. I'm seeing some stuff on adult self-care and staff wellness. What are some things people have done with that?
I can share. I forgot to mention this to my group because I was thinking about the teams I coach outside of my co-op, but internally we are doing self-care for our own staff. So we're going to come up with like a theme of the month, and then we are going to like interview. So this coming month, our theme is organization, because that brings people's like mental health, you know, down, and they're calmer when they can work on organization. So we're going to interview, which is going to be kind of fun, an administrator and a teacher for how are they helping build their own organization and routines. And then we're also going to have a PowerPoint on research, real brief. And then we're going to have a secondary live session they could join, like to just chat with their colleagues. So we're going to do that each month, which is going to be kind of cool, I think.
Awesome. Thank you, Lynn.
I've also done some self-care with the staff. Thank you, Amy. We used your video about self-care. And so then they all did their self-rating and made available a plan if they wanted to use that without adding another requirement onto those first days. But then we did a full staff community circle. You know, talked about our feelings, all those uncomfortable feelings, and then went around and said, you know, named a more comfortable feeling, something that we're grateful for, or that we're encouraged about, or hopeful. So that was a good way to do the community circle. And I was new at the school, so it introduced me to the staff also. And now we're doing a bingo with self-care items that we check off and turn in, and so we're doing that monthly also.
Thanks, Donna, for sharing. So as you're thinking about supporting students, we know that staff regulation is key, right? If we aren't coming in a state of calm, we can't really support students to stay calm. And so we love that. I think Amy's posting the link, thank you, to self-care content. And so feel free to look through and support. We also have some trainings, but I know that's not always able to join those. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Thank you guys for sharing in chat and with your voice so we can hear some things that are happening. So as we move into tier 2, we want you to really continue to think about that tiered fidelity inventory as your guiding light. So as you're shifting to whatever learning you are coming back to and shifting multiple plans multiple times, how can we continue to anchor to the evidence and the research behind PBIS and those critical features of implementation, which is the tiered fidelity inventory. So we want to continue to connect you to that, and maybe share in chat, have you assessed your implementation since COVID? Since going to virtual learning or hybrid learning, has your team looked at your tier 1 team, your tier 2 team? Have you reassessed using the TFI? And how might that help you prioritize some action planning that might need to happen? So continue to use that as your guide. So we want to think, before we start into tier 2 practices, the data around tier 2 and what might need to shift. So the TFI items that we want to think about here are screening, which is really about early access, and really noticing that screening does not always, is not just about using a universal screener for social emotional behavior, but using data to help us to identify and that core feature of early access, right? So what data points are we using to help us to identify students who need more support? Our request for assistance process is another huge piece to that early access. If we have strong requests for assistance processes, so staff know to refer or request support for a student, we're going to identify students earlier. And then we also have to have a system for monitoring student performance, which includes data decision rules. So that's highlighted over there in that scoring criteria. So as you're thinking about those data decision rules and screening and identifying students, we really want to think about using naturally occurring data sources. We think about that when we're in person. So we're going to use some of the same data sources as if we were in person learning this year, but we might need to adjust or modify some others. But we want to keep them as we're already collecting this data. We already have to have this data. Now, how can we use it to identify students needing support? What are some multiple avenues of how we might get that data, students, family, staff, and we need to make sure that we have data decision rules, but then we can have some exceptions to those rules. But without data decision rules, everything becomes an exception and we're not very efficient in our processes, right? So decision rules are really helpful. And remembering that those decision rules are contextual depending on your school. So you don't want to take someone else's data decision rules and drop them into your context because it doesn't always fit that way, right? So you want to take the concept, but not the actual rule. So here's some traditional data points that you're probably already using and monitoring at Tier 1 to help you identify when students need additional supports. What we want you to consider for distance learning or hybrid learning is continuing with those office discipline referrals, but you might need to be adjusting or modifying those definitions of what's problem behavior in a virtual learning format or distance learning format or hybrid format. We might want to think about the engagement. And I'm going to share an example of some ways to think about that on the next slide. We also might think about some wellness check-ins. And again, there's another example of that. And how do we support staff to make stronger referrals to Tier 2? When might a teacher be concerned during virtual or hybrid learning? What might be some things they should be watching for to help us identify students? Do students and families know what supports are in place? Now more than ever, we probably need to be engaging our students and families to know what supports do we have as we're in this hybrid or virtual format of learning. So this slide is from Attendance Works. This is some ways to think about engagement and monitoring. So, you know, it's the contact. Our families, are we making contact? Are they responding to our communications, our emails, to teachers reaching out through whatever form of contact we're making? Are they able to connect with us? Do they have the technology? Do they have technology skills to actually connect in? Are we maintaining relationships? Can students still name a staff member or an adult in the building that they can connect with and that they would go to if they need help? Even if we're in remote instruction, can they still name that they have somebody to do that? And then that participation rate, right? So these categories of contact, connectivity, relationships, and participation kind of help us to think about how might we define engagement and what data points can we use to monitor that. I mentioned that idea of wellness checks. So this is from the brief on adapting check and check out. So wellness checks, and some example questions that we might be asking. Again, this might be where you ask, can you name an adult that you would go to for support? How often then would you be checking in? What method would you use? Who's going to actually look at that data to identify when a student needs more support? So not only do you do the wellness checks, but you have to have the systems in place to be monitoring that data as well. Here's what data decision rules might already look like from traditional implementation of in-person. but we might need to come and revisit with our tier 2 systems team around how do we modify those for our current learning structures? Do we need to add things like no logging in or extensive referrals from families? So how might we adjust based on the data points that we're using? Some reminders for universal screening. So what I just shared was all about those 3 TFI items around early access and screening, but I hadn't mentioned universal screening yet. So universal screening is an important feature for helping us identify students early, but we also know if you are not already using a universal screener, now is probably not the time to try to install a universal screener district-wide. Teachers are already adjusting and doing too much. And so that might be one of those shiny temptation things that we probably should stay away from at this time. But instead, adjust how you're using data to help you to respond. If you are using a universal screener, remember that they're not necessarily normed for our current circumstances. They weren't normed during a pandemic. So how does that adjust? And that we always it's always one data point. So what are the other data points that are helping us to plan the interventions for support for a student? So just because they're elevated on a screener, are there other data points that are telling us that there's a need for additional support as well? We might want to think about using youth or family reports as an option if our students aren't in person with teachers. And how do we have to be prepared to respond when we identify students using a screener, right? So just some reminders about what screening might look like. So let's take take a couple minutes in your breakout rooms just to say what are some additional data points that you're using, what does that look like, and how are you systematizing using those data points for screening and identifying. So I think as Diane,
Rooms are open. And I have some folks that must have been, if you remember your rooms, just let me know. Elisa, Sarah, if you remember your room number.
Unable to be first breakout. I wasn't able to